Thank you so much, Matt, and welcome, everyone. Welcome to this Ethics Institute's, our celebration of Global Ethics Day 2025. For us, it is really indeed a global day in terms of the countries that are represented here today. 30 in total, and I'm going to read out some of them. It's global, as I've said. Mauritius, Kenya, Namibia, Ghana, Zambia, America, South Sudan, Liberia, Brazil, Benin, Myanmar, South Korea, Turkey, Tanzania, the UK, Austria, Ireland, the Netherlands, Mozambique, Botswana, Eswatini, Poland, Rwanda, Canada, Hong Kong, Lesotho, Barbados, and Qatar. Welcome, and of course, South Africa. So welcome to each and every one of you. And I hope that you find this session today inspiring and motivating. So the Global Ethics Day was established by the Carnegie Council in 2014 already. And this is an annual moment for individuals and organizations to explore the values and principles behind ethical decision-making. And that is exactly what we will do today. Hence, the theme of our day is Ethics Re-envisioned, Ethical Decision-Making in Difficult Times. And we know that we are living in times that really test our ethical compass. Every day, we face decisions where values, needs, and goals collide, and it's not always clear what the right choice would be. That's why we believe that we need to rethink how we see ethics, not just as a set of distant rules, but as a practical tool that helps us navigate these tough situations. Ethics isn't about perfection. I'm sure that we can all attest to that. It is about making thoughtful choices, even when the options aren't ideal. It's about taking responsibility for the impact of our decisions, including the unintended consequences. Good ethical decision-making then doesn't just focus on the best choices. It also asks, how do we minimize harm and do right by others? But we can't do it alone. Ethical reasoning works best when we bring together different perspectives and collaborate across disciplines and experiences and cultures. Virtue matters, of course, yes, but it's not enough on its own. We need to create cultures, systems, and habits that make ethical behavior practical, visible, and valued. Ethics should be a tool for living well, not just an excuse for justifying self-interest or power, like we see globally happen so often. So today, we have three experts who will guide us from an international perspective, a regional perspective, and organizational, institutional, individual perspective in terms of ethical decision-making in difficult times. And I forgot to introduce myself before I introduce our speakers. I am Liezl, Groenewald, the CEO of the Ethics Institute. My apologies for that. All right, so our speakers, and I'm going to read a little bit, first introduce all of them and then start with their questions. So our speakers are, from an international perspective, Professor Katua Plant, and she is an associate professor at the Faculty of Economic and Management Sciences at the University of Pretoria. She holds a BCom Honours degree in Accounting Sciences, Katua, a master's degree with specialization in workplace ethics, cum laude, and a PhD in international auditing. She is also a certified internal auditor, CIA, accredited by the Institute of Internal Auditors Global. She started working, or her career, she commenced at the University of Pretoria in 1995 and is a lecturer in financial accounting and has since presented courses in auditing, business, and professional ethics and governance. And Katua has also been presenting business ethics for different organizations, which includes the Ethics Institute. Welcome, Katua. Then our next speaker will be Mr. Danny Balluck, all the way from Mauritius, and he is the Chief Financial Officer for Southern Africa and the Executive Director for Standard Chartered Bank Mauritius. Danny is a Fellow of the Association of Chartered Certified Accountants from the UK, and he served on the Mauritius Institute of Directors and Governance for 5 years, including 2 years as Vice Chairman and 2 as Chairman. He's also a member of the Mauritius Institute of Professional Accountants and currently chairs the Financial Reporting Monitoring Panel of the Financial Reporting Council. It is a mouthful. Danny serves as an alternate director at the Mauritius Bankers Association. And he is a regular speaker and panelist on topical issues and was named Africa's CFO of the Year in 2022. Wonderful. Welcome, Danny. And last but definitely not least is our own Dr. Lincoln Cave, who is a senior ethics subject matter expert at the Ethics Institute. And Lincoln will talk to us about ethical decision-making from an organizational or institutional perspective. Lincoln has over 30 years of experience in national security and international relations. He was also posted abroad for a number of years, and he holds a doctorate in public management. He, along with many other postgraduate qualifications from the Universities of Pretoria and Johannesburg, he has facilitated extensive ethics training and awareness initiatives across various organizational functions, including security managers from national and provincial entities and members of foreign intelligence services. In addition, he has led Global Ethics Day within the State Security Agency. And then he also serves as a voluntary external advisor at Northwest University Center for Geopolitical Security and Strategy, and has published quite extensively on ethics and in specifically the intelligence environment. And then lastly, Lincoln is a former non-executive director of Curioso Academy and also a member of the Institute of Directors South Africa. Welcome, Lincoln. All right, to everyone on this call, you can see and hear that we have quite an expert panel here with distinguished careers and a lot of experience and exposure to assist us with answering some difficult questions today. I am going to start with Prof. Plant, Katua, as we know her, and I see some of her students as well. And Katua, your question is focused on the international environment, okay? And specifically, we have we know we currently have this volatile global environment that is entrenched with severe challenges. So in this environment, which is marked by geopolitical conflict, intensifying inequality and climate crisis, how can ethics serve as a practical tool to navigate competing values and interests beyond virtue signaling or power-driven justifications?
Thank you, Liezl. Thank you so much for the kind introduction, and thank you also for the impactful question that you are asking. So just good morning to everybody. Let me call you ethical stakeholders today, and it's wonderful to see some of my alumni students. Great to see you all, and very exciting to talk about one of my passions, and that is ethics. So as an academic, I have to start with, with unpacking some of the notions that you've highlighted, Liezl, and that is, what are we facing? So I'm using this diagram, and credit to ChatGPT, to show that our world today is exposed to severe, significant risks. And as you've mentioned, Liezl, these risks include inequality, geopolitical conflict, climate crises, etc. So there's a blank drain drop there, because we cannot mention all the risks. But today we are living in an era of risk, and our ethics risks actually are the foundation of everything. So everything, in my view, has an ethical dimension. So on a global scale, the environment, we are faced with severe risks. And together with that, you can see on the diagram, I'm showing our world. We are living in a complex world with a disruptive environment. And we need a protective umbrella. You see the umbrella there protecting our world with outcomes such as we want legitimacy, we are striving towards sustainability on a global scale, value creation within business, equity. And to me, which is very important, which you can't see here, and actually, I first wanted to show it on the slide, but then I thought maybe that is ethics. Maybe ethics is like the wiring of this umbrella. So if one wire is broken, the umbrella is going to collapse. So we can have the most beautiful policies and principles and procedures and rules in place, but if the wiring of the umbrella is broken, that umbrella is going to collapse. So every organization, every nation, every country actually needs a strong and effective umbrella, protecting the umbrella, where the wiring of the umbrella is that ethics. So I think we all know that a lot of countries have wonderful policies and procedures in place, white papers, green papers, yellow papers, but those principles and rules in those policies are not institutionalized, and that creates challenges. So if we just look at two of the major challenges that Liezl mentioned, and that is virtue signaling. So we are sitting with a huge crisis these days of countries and organizations and political leaders that are displaying and communicating ethics, but they're not living it. It's for image management, it's for compliance, but it's not a conviction. It was not internalized and institutionalized. So that is the one crisis we sit with. And then the other crisis that Liezl mentioned, and that is the power play. And I don't even have to mention examples of countries where we see the leadership using their power to abuse and manipulate, etc. So they are rationalizing their authority, and ethics is used to dominate. To them, it's a strategy and it's not a conviction. So it's very, very important on a global scale that ethics becomes a conviction. And it can. I'm very passionate about making ethics practical as well. So we have to think of those practical considerations. So on a global scale, I would say government, organizations, politics, we have to start talking about ethics. Ethics dialogue is critical. So we have to talk about ethics, the ethical dimensions of all our decisions. Who are all the stakeholders involved? And it's not about just having moral courage, but it's having authentic moral courage to stand up for what is right. And when we have the ethics dialogue and we go into moral reasoning, it needs to be transparent. It needs to be transparent, and people must see that we walk the talk. And then important in terms of these global challenges that we are facing, should we not strive for a shared moral language, a kind of a universally accepted ethical practice? I'm asking the question because there are scholars coming from the academic side who will debate against that. And then we need to build resilience, and that for that we need to build trust. That trust relationship, always serving the public interest, the stakeholders, etc. And that will then lead to what I have as the panels of my umbrella: the legitimacy, the sustainability, the equity. And from a practical perspective, we have quite a few guidelines, and I think maybe on a global scale, our sustainability development goals is a very good example of how, on a global scale, how we can create value. So we want to move on a global scale beyond just mere economic and political survival, ticking the boxes. We really want to inspire, I would say, a collective purpose. And if we're wearing our ethics hat and we're creating and developing this ethics umbrella with the wiring of the umbrella, if we have that mindset, then it will be much easier to consider the ethicality of decisions. Because everything, I think, in life, most things in life, is about managing risks. And similarly, we have to manage our ethics risks, even at an international and a global scale. And then just in terms of our global challenges, some additional challenges that we are facing. I've mentioned inequality. We have the wars now we see, that's quite current. And here ethics can function as a normative compass guiding us. If you look at the classic ethics theories, and in South Africa as well, we have Ubuntu, those theories can also be used, not in isolation. I see that we can view those ethics theories in an integrated way to help us to solve ethical dilemmas at a global scale, at an organizational scale, and at an individual level, which you'll hear later today. So the questions that come to mind are, what economic activities are justifiable? Who bears the costs of profit generation? What is our moral strategy as a country and an organization? Is it bread first, morals later, or are we striving to act with integrity and for acting and taking decisions in the best interests of all the stakeholders and not merely profits? So we want to balance the need for profits and purpose. Global supply chains, huge risk. How do we manage our supply chains to give credit and to recognize all our stakeholders and not to cause harm? So those are some of the key issues, challenges, and then to share some of those. I want to call it, because I come from an auditing background. So if we have risks, we have to implement controls to manage or reduce those risks. So what are some of those ethics controls that we can implement, that organizations, markets, political parties can implement to reduce the risks? I don't think we can eliminate the risks completely, but we have to reduce the ethics risks to an acceptable level. And some of the things we can do, and I think that quite, you're all familiar with that, responsible sourcing. What agreements do we sign at a global level? Where do we source our products from, etc.? Human rights, I've mentioned that. Fair trade. Fair trade is another example. With the climate crisis, I've mentioned the UN goals. We also have our ESG reporting. And I actually see ESG as small e, small s, and large G. Because if we talk about governance, it actually includes our environment and our social impact. And I even want to call this umbrella that I have on the screen the governance umbrella, because it almost encapsulates everything. So in terms of ESG reporting, we have the King report, King 5 coming out now, already out. And then we have our technological challenges. So some of those controls addressing technology issues on a global scale. We have our AI, we have AI ethics as a control, and digital rights, etc., privacy rights. So those are some of the corrective controls or preventative controls that we can implement on a global scale.
Thank you, Katua. I think we'll explore further during the question time. I made a few notes, such important perspectives that you've given us in terms of just ethics dialogue. We need that globally. Authentic moral courage. I really like that one. It's that authentic moral courage. And then this universally shared moral language. I think that will be quite an effort to get there. Thank you very much. We will engage in further discussions. But for now, we move over to Danny. Danny will give us a regional perspective. And Danny, my question to you basically is that considering the historical legacies of inequality, ongoing governance failures, and social fragmentation in Southern Africa, what ethical approaches can help leaders and communities make principled yet pragmatic decisions that can balance development, inclusion, and accountability?
Yeah. So thank you very much. Very good morning and good afternoon to all of you, wherever you're dialing from. I understand there's a lot of countries dialing from the West and some from the East as well. So very warm welcome. Thank you to the Ethics Institute for inviting me on this very special day. It's an important day indeed. The Professor Kato has already given a good picture of the situation on the ethics. First of all, let me take stock on where we are today, and then go into the gist of the question that you asked. During the last decades, governance failures unfortunately have taken center stage, in most of the developed markets, and also we've seen in many emerging countries as well. And Southern Africa region has not been an exception to that. The current global environment we are living with is an ongoing political tensions combined with societal change, and good governance practices have never been more important than they have today. The post-major elections in 2024 in major parts of the world, and last year it was a year of record elections globally, and also in our region, namely South Africa has had the elections as well, and Mauritius has also a fair share of election last year. A lot of progress has been made though, policy reform, but still a lot of people still facing extreme difficult conditions. We have poverty, high cost of living with persistent elevated inflation, and also institutions are really under pressure to perform. It is clear from what we see the job of country leaders, policymakers are becoming more and more complex, and pressure from the population is mounting day by day, especially when the expectations are not met. And watching the news, you would see many examples in countries like France, UK. Recently, we saw Nepal, and closer to us, Madagascar, on what's happening today. The new Gen Z is impatient and wants quick results, and it's not prepared to compromise on delays and governance shortfalls. And we are living in a period of profound ethical crisis. And the sad part, which we need to call out today, is that despite all these events, it is quite unfortunate that some leaders do not seem to learn from the lessons of governance and corruption cases, which had, devastating effects on people and the society at large. Drawing from the recent scandal we've seen, it is clear that poor governance and bad ethics has diminished the efficiency of public spending and investment through institutions. And all these events have a common denominator. The common denominator is unethical practice and behavior. And this is quite an important element for people to retain and to understand. That common denominator is keep coming back year on year on every country, every scandal that you would see. And there's a wide recognition that the consequences of these poor ethical behaviors and bad governance create huge inequality in our society. When you ask the question about inequality, why we have that gap, inequality, and so on, and these are the consequences of poor ethical behaviors. And ethics is one of the important pillars of governance. I had the opportunity to speak as well, being part of the Institute of Directors, where we had a lot of governance talks, governance conferences, and we keep reminding people that ethics is only one pillar of the governance. We have other pillars like the conduct, integrity, transparency, conflict of interest, and all these pillars are interconnected and cannot be decoupled. And it is indeed a critical time for us on this special day to have a profound reflection and an open discussion about ethics. It is not just a casual conversation, but about the future of our society, just as important as climate change. And to me, I think we're not talking enough about ethics. We talk a lot about climate change, a lot of societal, but the profound causes of inequalities is more on the ethical, I would say, behavior. Every single year of inaction to address unethical leadership leads to more economic losses, inequality, poverty, and devastating consequences. And we live in a region where we have so many examples about that kind of gap that keep creating in terms of of inequality, poverty, access to education, and everything. And we have witnessed so many cases of governance failures caused by these unethical behaviors. And this is not only in Southern Africa, but it's a global issue. And it's not surprising if you see great loss in public trust in institutions. And surely it's not a good legacy we can leave for the new generation. Some countries have reformed their governance system and reaping the benefits. A leading example is Singapore, and we keep quoting Singapore as the best in class. And other countries like New Zealand, Finland, Iceland, and Norway are also great examples to learn from. And in these countries that I have just mentioned, transparency is the overarching principle in public affairs, and also accountability, and ensuring that governments provide adequate information and justification of how public monies are spent. And all these are underpinned by strong ethical culture and by doing the right thing. And finally, I would say that we are living in a world where crisis now is the new norms, and given its frequency, and these crises, institutions, and it has also demonstrated that institutions that are led ethically can be more resilient and better faces certain crises. And because three important aspects, we have exemplary leadership and strong accountability, we have reputation capital, and also a clear framework for addressing misconduct and governance shortfall. There's a lot of crime that goes unpunished. There's a lot of fraud cases, not only go unpunished, but you are unable to recover all these taxpayers' money. And this is extremely sad. And we have a lot of announcement, a lot of things that we'll hear in the news. But at the end of the day, have we recovered all these the corruption money, and how many people do we see behind the bars on who have been convicted for corruption? So these are bits of the gaps that we see today. And later on, as we progress into the discussion, we can go into certain practical example and measures that we can advocate for people to adopt, either from an organizational perspective, but also from the government or institution.
Thank you so much, Danny, for sharing your extensive knowledge about the region with us. And I think, well, you said everything you said was so true. The one thing that resonated so well with me now was the governance failures that we have, not seeing ethics as the foundation of many of the crises that we are facing, like climate change, for example. And then, of course, the trust issue that Katua also talked about. Where is that trust? Because we see corruption, we see these huge inequalities caused by corruption, but we don't see, like we say in South Africa, anyone in yellow, orange uniforms, behind the bars. So, yeah, looking forward to the further discussion with you in this regard, Danny. Thank you. Hey, Lincoln.
Thank you very much, Liezl.
Lincoln, so I am talking to you, or you are going to talk about, we've done now global, international, regional, and we want to come now to the organizational or institutional or individual level. So how can ethical reasoning be institutionalized beyond mere compliance to guide everyday decision-making, where trade-offs between profits for the organization, people, and purpose of the organization and as individuals become unavoidable?
Thank you very much.
Over to you.
Thank you. And good morning to our panel members as well, and those that are on this webinar. I think to start off, the importance here is to really for us to have common understanding and a shared view. One, we agree that companies exist for purpose of profit, generating profit, for sustainability, job creation. But linked to that, because they operate in the economic environment, and the political sphere, there is the other dimension of public value. So the financial value is always uppermost compared to the public value. Now, public value is where the undermining of the overall value set of organizations come into play. And why? Because we see that there's growing conflict of interest, biased reasoning that anchors on the interest of self to the detriment of others. And the factors that comes into play there are really the organizational culture, the type of leadership that exists to really give effect negatively to that. Now, ultimately, it undermines the moral capital of the organization. And that moral capital encompasses the issue of trust, as the other panelists have alluded to, but also business success. So if this happens, then we have a situation where really the disjointness in ethical reasoning and decision-making, whether it is at a top level or at the lowest level in organization, where ethical blindness or moral blindness creeps in. And that is the inability to really see the ethical dimension to an issue or situation. So if we look at it in that context, then we need to ask then, what is the proper role of ethical reasoning? And it has two extremes. On the one side, it is really to highlight X, which enhances the well-being of others or all concerned, and that should be praise sang. On the extreme part of it is where it does harm and it needs to be criticized. So that is the uppermost. Linked thereto is then also when we deal with these issues of reasoning and decision making, it happens at also two extremes, which I want to highlight in terms of ethical doctrines. You either adopt an altruistic approach where you focus on the well-being and interest of others more so than yourself. And in that, if you do that, then the element of the ethical value standards of transparency, fairness comes into play. And you see that manifest then also where there is consultation, because consultation can only be manifested where there's open communication, where there's transparency, where there's fairness. But then the opposite side of it is also the issue of ethical egoism. Now, in itself, it is not only anchored in myself, me or us as an organization or as a business entity, because you look at it from the one spectrum also to the other. And the other is, for example, a business owner would incentivize the workforce to increase productivity. But the self-centeredness for him or her would be also that while he incentivizes the employee and they benefit in the process, it also creates then an increase in profitability, in business success. So those are the extremes. But then the issue of ethical blindness really is an area that creeps in, where the dimension of discretionary powers, the board decides to venture in a direction that impacts the organization or impacts even the external stakeholders. Let's take, for example, the US case of its diversity and equity policy. You have big companies that had diverse responses to it. One, Apple and Uber, they decided, no, for us, it makes business sense to sustain our diversity, DEI policy and practice, because ultimately the footprint is global and we need to ensure that it makes business sense. Now you have the diverse and contrast where you see that Deloitte, for example, one company, but in two jurisdictions take distinct different views, where the British said, nope, we will continue focusing on our diversity and equity. We will continue to report on it. But we've also seen in terms, if you anchor it in the ethical reasoning and the decision-making, what has transpired up to date, even in the broader context of a company like Deloitte. So that says a lot. Now, where are the risks further manifesting is if you look in South Africa's context, we have a growing small and medium enterprise environment. But if you ask why are they failing, you realize that the ethical cultural risk and ethical behavioral risk manifest as prominent. For example, that there's no distinction between the capital of the company vis-a-vis private capital. So this becomes really blurred. And we splurge on what is supposed to be accountability for the profits and funds that the company needs to be held accountable for. Now, if we go further and we look really at what I just want to share in terms of a slide show, is really to anchor the issue further. I hope it is visible.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay,
it's in presentation period.
Okay, so presentation mode, there we go. Now, if you, for example, look at these slides, 3 of them, and when we look at the media article, because ultimately public value translate into the perceptions or factual reality of what's going on in organizations in terms of how we experience the ethical decision-making. And here are 3 distinct examples. In the one case, you have the Mandela family that declined government's offer to renovate the president's house. The other one, you have a CFO that was involved in a conflict of interest situation, and the service provider that was involved in this process decided to pay the bail. Questionable. How then do you link what is said in terms of understanding the importance of ethical reasoning? Because ultimately, it is to consider all of the facts, consider the ethical dimension to the issue. Now, here again, oversight was not followed in the case of Deloitte. So really three extremes. And I think I have to ask you, which one is grounded in ethical reason and decision-making? It is probable that you're going to say, yes, this one. Because ultimately we sit in a society where we have economic challenges, economic realities, where politicians perhaps might be quick, looking at our past history, to go and assist for self-interest and say, but it must be done in this fashion. But ultimately, the greater good becomes undermined also. And this is the intent of ethical reason and decision-making, making sure that the extremes we try to bring together as best as we can, as was said. Now, how do we deal with it in a practical context when we look at these two? I think we need to be aware that if we make decisions as practical as we can, how will it look really in the media? And going back to the example that I highlighted about the Mandela family, even in the business environment, public or private sector, in the SOEs, how will it look like for me as a business owner, as a CEO, as a board a chairperson in the media tomorrow? Is my decision legally grounded? Is it aligned to my organizational values or those of my own? Because ultimately, the ethical dilemma that comes in most of the time, if it's diverge from what we actually say on paper and how we practice it, there's disjointness. We sit with these type of challenges as reflected in the example below. At the end, we need to consider then, what is my role and responsibility to contribute to effective reasoning? Because ultimately reasoning, you have to consider the issue of clarity, accuracy, relevance of an issue or matter under discussion. The outcome thereof is the decision that you have to carry. I think this remains relevant. You need to be ethically aware. Whether you decide as a collective or individual, at the lowest level or the highest level. And ultimately, courage speaks to the issue of all of us needing to speak to issues that are not easy to speak about, even if it's uncomfortable. Leadership, ethical leadership, permeates across the hierarchy for me. Whilst it's important that setting the tone from the top becomes fundamental, and we see it in the leading practice, but accountability in terms of where you supervise, where you're in charge, where is a project, whatever, you need to model those values. Because ultimately, if it just remains on a piece of paper as a code or as a policy, and it is not giving the impetus that it warrants or is necessary, we find ourselves in the situation where we are, where we have a mass amount of commissions, a mass amount of reviews that speaks to the same issue. But we ask ourselves then, so where is the problem? And it is anchored really in the accountability part of it that is put on the side, and we deal with the issues of, for ease of comfort, self-interest. So ultimately, the importance is really be aware, be courageous, and show leadership in the decision-making and in the ability that you go about making those cognitive or intellectual thinking process so that it benefits ultimately all concerned. Because that is the commencement of where you either dilute or increase the public value of your organization. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lincoln, for that insightful presentation. And then also, again, we are focusing here on a model that we can use as individuals, and I think it can also be used by organizations. And, just to guide them simplistically through an ethical dilemma. And I see a thread here from international, regional, and individual or organizational levels when it comes to ethics being the foundation of all the decisions that we take, many of the decisions that we take. And Danny, I mentioned that, something like climate change, something like inequality, corruption, the foundation of that, why it is there is because there's no ethical foundation to these actions. And it seems that, yes, globally, there are efforts in some jurisdictions to ensure that we do get to develop that universal moral language, but it's in pockets. It's not truly global. So what is important to me is that one has these dialogues that we're having today. And in that process, we create more awareness of the issues that we face in these challenging times. But I want to move and ask you a question. It's a long question, but I'm going to ask it nevertheless. There's in this world where markets and political systems increasingly prioritize efficiency and power, how can ethics move beyond symbolic gestures? Because we see that so often. Move beyond the symbolic gestures to become actually an active force that shapes institutional design and economic regulation. In other words, ethics infused in all of these, and then ensuring through this that moral values such as justice, dignity, and accountability are structurally embedded rather than just rhetorically invoked.
Thank you, Liezl. Yes, so I think that question ties in nicely with the umbrella I showed. So I think we should have that mindset to build an ethics umbrella. So we need to build the wiring of the umbrella, an ethics umbrella, if we want the ethical architecture of our countries, of our organizations, etc. So again, I want to highlight just moving from mere compliance and having those policies and procedures in place to really institutionalize those policies and procedures. So moving from intentions to really institutionalizing. And some ways of doing it, okay, we have King, but we still see that companies are reporting on King, they're ticking the boxes, but is it a mindful application of those principles and practices? And are they doing it for short-term gain, or is it for long-term sustainability? So that could be one way, moving from intentions to institutionalization. Another one is to look at the systems. Have we considered the ethicality of the systems at a global level? So, for example, at an institutional level, have we considered justice when we develop our procurement systems and our supply chain systems that will prioritize equity and will have the necessary anti-corruption safeguards and controls in place? Have we considered dignity to guide our labor markets, etc.? Have we considered accountability and transparency? So those are just two. And then the last one I maybe just mentioned, which I think Lincoln also addressed, and that is leadership. If the leadership is not committed to ethics, then it's going to be very, very challenging to implement and institutionalize these ethics controls and practices.
No, indeed. It's the old adage of, it starts at the top. It also rots from the top.
Top, yes.
So, thanks, Katua. Danny, if I can move to you with the question, is that in a time of extreme volatility and disruption, when public trust in institutions is declining, as you have indicated a little bit earlier as well, how can that ethical leadership that Sue has just spoken about reshape governance to become more accountable, transparent, and inclusive in our region and broader, of course?
Yeah. Well, thank you. I think that that's a very, very important question, and it is very topical as well. So I think the first one is the tone from the top, and as it set the stage for any world-class ethics and exemplary leadership. This could be the leaders in governments, institutions, senior public officials, or even in the private sector. And you have companies which is classified as a public interest entity as well. So where the board and the senior management play a crucial role. And we need to ensure that it gets louder as it is cascaded down to the organization, not simply from the middle, but also down into the grounded level. So that's very important. And in doing so, we need to create a culture of integrity by setting the right tone itself. And if you expect, for example, the population employees to display an exemplary level of ethics, the starting point is to ensure that the proper tone is set right from the top. So all leaders, whether you're in the government institution and so on, and or the private organization, need to act as a role model. And that's very important. And they should be complemented by establishing a right culture and environment for at all levels of the institution and organization in a very consistent manner. Where it fails is that you have a certain tone that is set and it is not properly implemented or lived into different levels of the institution or organization. Sometimes you will see a lot of situations where people will do what is convenient and not what is always right. And I always struggle to understand people at very senior level when they say, that they don't have a choice. We always have a choice, and to choose between what is right or wrong. And we should not have, or even, for example, present excuses that, they don't have a choice in a decision at the board or wherever it is. The second important aspect is to lead by example. And it might appear very simplistic, but when leaders practice what they preach, they earn trust. And trust is the foundation of any successful country, team, business, and the community. And people will follow those who are consistent, honest, and accountable, not just in words, but in action. I can tell you that in the new world order we are living, this is what exactly the new generation is watching carefully. And what was tolerable in the past will not be tolerable as we move forward with the new generation. Leading by example will also inspire people. When leaders work with a passion, we show discipline, faces challenges with integrity, it encourages everyone around us to rise to the same standard. And it creates that culture of motivation and not obligation. And the kind of leadership, that fosters accountability. And when we take responsibility of our action, even our mistake, we show others that growth is more important than the ego. As a matter of fact, and I haven't come across a lot of politicians, at least not from a country, who has publicly apologized for their past mistakes, right? So what I've seen, a lot of people will come with excuses, but public apology it's not something that you would see and say, sorry, we made a mistake, and these are the actions that we are taking. There's always a blame game that's go around the circle when you have certain wrong policy decision or a mishappening and so on. So that culture of integrity by far is one of the biggest determinants of behaviors. The best and most effective organization is where you have an environment where people feel free to talk and to challenge without any fear of victimization. And there's an ongoing discussion around Freedom of Information Act and so on that is being discussed in the country. And I'm sure in other countries in the Southern Africa region as well. And that kind of culture where people feel free to talk, of course, with certain guardrails and parameters, is very important. And very often, and we would see a very clear disconnect between the speeches and narrative of leaders when they are not in power and the actual actions on the ground. And this is quite, I would say, outrageous when people will take the mic and address people around the speech, but that doesn't translate into real action. We, as a global bank, Standard Chartered, we strongly believe that ethical leadership is not just about doing the right thing; it's a strategic advantage. It builds trust, it drives performance, and ensures that the organization serves the purpose sustainably and justly. Delivering a nice speech and intention are good, but operationalization, the values of ethics, is what matters the most. And my understanding of prosperity for all is centered around equality. Addressing inequality requires a multifaceted approach that targets the root cause, the consequences, and disparities in wealth. We talk about the education, access to healthcare, and also access to opportunities. And government has a crucial role in reducing that inequality by implementing policies and initiatives across various sectors. And lastly, I would say the policymakers should prioritize policies that explicitly target inequality while investing in the growth and development of the country. Both can work and should work in parallel. That is what exemplary leadership is all about. And this is only then that we can talk about reducing the gap between the rich and the poor and reducing the inequality that exists in the Southern Africa region.
Thank you, Danny. Powerful words from your side. Thank you. South Africa is the most unequal country in the world, and then we have the rest of the region, of course, and it is all caused by this lack of integrity. And one problem you talked about now, that let's say politicians, that what they say today is not necessarily the same that they're going to say tomorrow. It's all based on who they are talking to. But when you look at organizations, for example, we have experienced quite a lot that people say, but look what's happening outside. Look what the politicians are doing. No one is being held accountable. So where must I now get my motivation to do the right thing? Because I don't see that example. But I think that is when we then again go from that level or go on into the organizational level. And you have said that ethics must permeate through all levels in the organization. But now I want to link that now, Lincoln, to your question, or a question for you is, how can that ethical reasoning then be addressed in organizations? So say we don't have an ethical lead in the organization, or there are people that it seems are not being held accountable. What can the individual in an organization do?
Thank you, Liezl.
To reason ethically.
Thanks. I think the importance is to acknowledge that the majority of people are there and they want to do good, because your ethics is shaped by your personal values, by societal norms, by common law, legislation, all of those influencing, and you draw the best from it. So when you come into an organization, the organizational values that's agreed upon that you find, you need to harness it and shape. Now, the biggest problem comes in also is where there's the notion of group thinking, that because they are doing it therefore, or I am safe under the guise of everyone is doing it. And that is organizational culture. It is not an ethical culture. An ethical culture is really the issue of professionalism, those value sets, transparency, fairness, as alluded to. But anchored in that, first and foremost, is that we need to understand we have a legal obligation, that we have a duty of care because I'm incontracted and I'm paid to do a job. And if I do not understand that, there cannot be other excuse, because then the question comes in, what are the risks then of continuing on a trajectory of being unethical in conduct and practice? Because the implications, we see it. For any ethics scholar today, you can just go and sit in front of the TV and listen to the Madlanga Commission or the ad hoc committee, and you will be able to get everything there. Leadership that blames, leadership that shows how playing the blame game, shifting responsibilities. Ultimately, at the individual level, you are accountable. So those rules and regulations that govern how we operate first and foremost must be understood. Secondly, the ethical dimension comes in because if it's anchored from, I always say that, even from a cultural perspective, we might be able to say that me and Danny have different cultures. We come from different cultural backgrounds. But the normative standards of thank you, no thank you, cuts across cultural dimensions. So these are things that are anchored in any institution. Now, leading practice are there to guide us if we doubt. And I think the King Code is but one. Let me just read quickly what the 2025 revised Committee of Sponsoring Organizations of the Threadway Commission, COSCO, emphasized. By promoting clarity in decision-making, aligning behaviors with the entity's purpose, and enabling faster, more informed responses to opportunity and risk, governance helps entities operate with greater agility and resilience. So if we do not appreciate that and we do not do our part, luckily for us in South Africa, we have a vibrant civil society. If organizations don't want to take it up, you have organizations that will take the last recourse and litigate to ensure then the ethical greater good. Because ultimately, public value is dependent and reliant from the individual up to the collective. So the group thinking cannot be an excuse because he said so. Accountability starts with the individual. And I think that is fundamental. So there are really structural processes that comes into play, and there are practical processes that comes into play. Now, if you look at businesses that have grown, it's because they have understood and continue to understand the ethical value that needs to be preached and practiced and lead from the top. I just want to highlight quickly also an example. In social media, there was a HR person that reported a case of an employee that got his or her salary, let's say 1100 this morning. 10 past 11, the person submitted his or her resignation. Now, the question was, what is your ethics? Why do you do this? Because we invested in you. But could it be that the culture is such that it does not align with my own value set? I'm running away. Lastly, and in conclusion, again from the ad hoc committee, we had SCOPA. For those that don't know, it deals with our public funds and how it is managed in public institutions. There was a gentleman, when they asked him to explain why did he not do X, Y, and Z on the road accident fund, he broke down in tears. He said, this is what I tried. So you sit with an environment where, yes, we're dealing sometimes with narcissists, and I think it needs to be highlighted as that. But either it is you play your part, or you decide to take your jacket or bag and you depart because it does not align. And this is the importance, I think, from a practical perspective that we need to understand. In organizations, we need to ensure that we contribute constructively for the purpose and intent that it is there and our role in doing so. Thank you.
Thank you, Lincoln. Sure. Also, very informative, and I see a lot of hands going on the screen. I like the group thing. I think our other speakers will agree that much of what goes wrong in organizations is related to that group thing, or I tell you to do so. So that pressure also. And you have mentioned civil society in South Africa. That's really powerful in the sense of, civil society stands up and they have brought about change. And then Danny has mentioned Gen Z, and it's amazing, what they also demand, but not in a negative way. It's just that they're not going to wait, 30 years, 10 years for a new policy or a new law to come into place. They want things to happen. And I think that's also a good pressure group, as long as they apply that pressure in the right way. So thank you, panelists. I see there's a number of questions. So before I ask you more questions, I'm going to go to Celia. And am I very soft?
Yes, you are. Yes, now it's better.
Oh, okay. My earphones. Yeah. All right, Celia, can you perhaps pose some questions from the audience?
Sure, we've got excellent questions, actually. I'm going to start with the chat. And I just want to kind of assure all the attendees that we will be answering the questions in a separate communication post the webinar. So please, if we don't get to your question today, it is really important, and we will do our very best to share some opinions and thoughts from the panel. So one really excellent question. There's actually so many in the chat happening, and as well as in the Q&A, but I would like to highlight one from Subetri. I hope I say your name correctly. You've posted that what you would like to hear more about from the panel is the underlying questions of power and how it is wielded. To act ethically assumes levels of equity in the system which are not in place. And that's throughout society, right? So basically, how do we engage where there is no interest in acting ethically because there is too much to lose? We see this play out in global arenas as we speak and going forward. So that is a real strong question. Liezl, did you want me to post any additional or share any others? Because I don't think we're going to have that much time. The questions are quite brilliant.
Okay, so let's see who of our panelists want to answer that very interesting question, or all of you can, of course. And then, Celia, we can go through the questions and see how far we get. Lincoln, Katua, Danny?
I can try. I can give my view because this is actually a question that keeps me awake at night, because the students are also asking me, why must they stand up? Why must they speak up for what is right? Because these people are being murdered. We've seen it now with the provincial hospital Tembisa issue, with Tabika. We see it, regularly in South Africa, that if people speak up, they are being murdered. So our students are telling me, but they're not going to speak up. So what is the alternative? So I would like to just use here, the analogy of the apples and the barrels, and that is, we as individuals, we are the apples, and we are put into an organization which is the barrel. If that organization has if it's a corrupt barrel with unethical culture, corrupt practices, etc., you as the good, honest apple, you will have to jump out. Like Lincoln also said, you'll have to run away if your values are not aligned to the values of the organization. One other alternative is reporting to external parties, but sometimes that also is not an avenue. So I would like to hear from Lincoln and Danny as well, what their views are, and what can I tell my students, how do you deal with these issues?
So if I can go, that there's the famous saying that said, like, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And to my earlier speech in terms of what I said, we need to have a culture where people are free to express their views and are free without any fear of victimization. And that would only come if you have an environment where you have checks and balance, you have accountability, you have strong institution, and the political system where you have the one in power can control every single thing, and you don't have a separate of power between institution, the guardrails, and the president or the prime minister, for example. This is where you end up. You have that situation where power will corrupt and absolute power will absolutely corrupt. So, and this is where you get in the danger zone. So there's no single ingredient or formula around how you can address, but that separation of power with a strong institution that really can have a very strong check and balance on what the political leader or the country leader has been appointed for. And if it comes again, it's a very practical situation where we have in many countries where the political leader or the prime minister or the president would have a strong control on the key institution, whether it would be the police, enforcement law, or the law, or any other institution. And this is where you get corruption. And this is where when you have, and these weak institution and people who don't understand ethics would really fall into the trap of being party to the unethical behavior and corruption. And this is where they get tempted. So I guess I'm not sure I've given the right answer, but at least to me, and there's a combination of this strong foundation of institution.
Thank you. I think this is the great and significance of discussing ethics and making it real, really, truly so, is that it gives you the spectrum of how you need to understand doing good for self and other, but balancing it, because it cannot be to the detriment of yourself or to other. So there has to be a balance. And I see now that some of the responses in terms of what I've highlighted, it is either fight or flight, that notion. Now, if it becomes too much and you see what other recourse do you have? Now, the importance here is to understand that building an ethical organization does not happen overnight. If the systems and processes are not in place, there needs to be an understanding it should be there. If we look at our constitutional prescripts, it defines the normative standards quite clear. Batu Pile derives from it as an example. It also defines the normative standards for various professions, quite clear. So the issue of how it is really institutionalized, made real, becomes the fundamental issue in who is taking that lead and who is ensuring the buy-in for it to realize. And if it does not happen, where does accountability then comes in? To hold institutional leaders, business leaders accountable. And we see the strong emphasis by regulators focusing on SOEs, focusing on private business. They take punitive action. In the political space, we see how it is permeating. Now the question comes in as to what the two panelists have also highlighted. Do we then say we fold our arms and do nothing? What legacy do we leave? What legacy do we build? And what do we ensure that at the end of the day, looking back, that we have contributed? So I would still believe that in our small environments, we can make a difference Hence the emphasis by the Ethics Institute doing this in a stakeholder and partnership basis, but also placing emphasis in making sure that there are ethics practitioners across the spectrum in business, in organizations that are empowered, capacitated to understand what is and are their roles. Now, the unfortunate reality is we deal with political parties, political leaders, that you can also ask, how are they inducted in terms of understanding their roles and responsibilities? First and foremost, it starts with the electorate. Unfortunately, you elect. But in that, you can only then, after 5 years, decide that, no, you have not played your part. Therefore, I reserve my right to vote not for you or for you. The other part is during the process of them playing their part as governance, public officials, the institutions must play their part. The ad hoc committees have a constitutional responsibility. To give you an example, and this is my view as I understand it. If you look at the Madlanga Commission, the Madlanga Commission's findings and the SCs have come out, it's not binding. If you look at the ad hoc committee, because they are constitutionally formed, they need to put those recommendations to the first citizen of the country, and they can go back and ask, what have you done? They can ask the speaker what they, so there's accountability, it's binding. Now, my argument is always, if we then say that they do not function, they must be held accountable by the public in the many ways that it allows. Hence, I refer to the issue of NGOs, civil society that comes up and say, if you do not play your part, we are then here. Now, the interest then also, as Liezl has said, comes the, how do you balance it and make sure it's balanced for the greater good, for the common good, and ensuring that the public value of our institutions, be it business SOEs or public entities, remain as they're supposed to be. Thank you.
Thank you to our panelists for answering that question. And I see we still have 19 left, Celia.
Yes.
Maybe one more question. I think that will be all that we're going to have time for, but let's see. Let's get another one, please.
Thank you, Liezl. I would love to pose Zodumo's question. Given that every decision carries an ethical dimension, how can leaders in internal audit foster a culture where ethical reflection becomes part of routine decision-making rather than a reactive consideration? A real good question there as well.
Got to it, Danny?
Thank you. Yes, so yeah, I firmly believe as an internal auditor that internal auditors must always wear their ethics hats. So not only internal auditors, but I think any person any person must consider the ethicality of their decisions. And specifically in organizations, when we take economic decisions, we have to consider the ethicality of those decisions. And I like to, I think organizations and internal auditors specifically must actually do it proactively and not reactively, as you've highlighted. And that could be to have it as a standing item on the agenda. Ethics must be a standing item on the agenda, and we must consider who are the stakeholders involved? Is this issue if the issue is an ethics issue, who are involved? What stakeholders are affected by it? Are we harming certain stakeholders? Is it against the law? Then we stop. So there's a process that we can go through. Not only internal auditors, but any person must go through a kind of a checklist to check whether there are any ethics risks associated with the decisions taken, with the systems implemented, etc.
Can I just supplement? So I think that's a great question because, and let's take it back in terms of what are the role of an internal auditor, first of all. think the role of the internal auditor is a third line of defense in many organizations, right? They are appointed in a position of trust, first of all, and they report to the board audit committee, and they're not part of the executive because they have to audit. So by this appointment in itself, the position of trust, you expect them to, first of all, ensure and to give the assurance to the board that the governance framework, the risk management, the control, the ethics are in good order, right? So if someone has been appointed in a position of trust to the board, they need to lead by example, and they need to report on that. And it goes without saying, this is the minimum standard that they should display as internal auditors, because these are the third line of defense. They are independent of the management of the executive. So I think it is obvious, but I won't state the obvious, because if there are certain, I would say, off track or divergence on that, it means that the board is not having the right auditor in place. And if you see the evolution of the internal audit function, there has been dramatic change. I work in a very regulated industry, and I've seen the expectation that the regulators and the board place of internal audit has dramatically evolved. It's not only signing on the financial statements, but it ranges from the ethics, the governance framework, the culture, the conduct, and everything. So the job of internal auditor now is not a boring job at all. It's a very, very dynamic, and it's a really in a position of trust. So simple answer, they should lead by example. They are in a very, very great position that the board, the trust that the board has placed on them. So they should operate in a very, very ethical manner. Otherwise, how can they sign off and give a report on ethics if they themselves, they don't display an ethics? That would be my answer. So,
Danny, I'm getting so excited. So I just want to, panel members, add something to that. And that is, yes, we need to have the professional ethics as internal auditors and set an example, but we also have to go out with our audit hats and our green pens, and we have to audit the ethical culture of the organization, the adequacy and effectiveness. And it's not just mere compliance, it's what are the real ethics outcomes? Are we, is the organization really ethically healthy? So yes, I agree with you 150%. We have a role to play as assessors of ethical culture.
Yeah, that's that adequacy, but adequacy isn't enough. It's that effectiveness. How did everything that we do in the company, has it actually translated into creating that ethical culture that we have spoken about? Colleagues, we have 6 minutes left, of which I require at least 3. And I was going to ask you some more questions. We still, see 21 questions in the Q&A. I don't know, it's always this problem of how much time do you allocate, but we will send, just to everyone, we will send the questions to the relevant speakers. Speakers, if you will then just provide the answers, we would appreciate that. And then I'm going to give you each 1 minute with a closing remark, your dream, your utopia for the world, basically, or the region. Danny, let's start with you.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much. So first of all, I would like to say thank you for the invitation and to express my views and insights on this subject. We can talk about ethics on the Global Ethics Day, but this is a daily conversation that we need to have. We need to live, the ethics, and we touch upon the inequality. So, and I think we will have to say it several times to political leaders that, bold reforms in housing, education, access to healthcare needs to go beyond politics and should prevail irrespective of which government is in power. And this is the only way we can reduce the gap of the inequality. And this inequality can only be achieved through ethical and exemplary leadership. And governments can not only improve societal justice, but also you drive the economic growth that comes with that. Leaders, that actively work by reducing the inequality through the pillars of the governance tend to see better long-term outcomes. So let us be those leaders at home, at work, in our communities, and let us lead with integrity, with action, and by example. Sometimes you get desperate, you lose hope when you see what's happening around you or, at certain levels of the politics. But don't lose hope. Let's do what we have to do. Let's do the right thing. Let's keep advocating what is right and make integrity and ethics, accountability, contagious and spread that positive vibes around us. And that would be my closing remarks. I don't lose hope. I have a strong positivity in my DNA. I will keep advocating that irrespective of what happened. Thank you.
Fantastic, Danny. Thank you for that inspiration. Lincoln, you're next on my screen.
Thank you, Liezl. I think for me, we need to acknowledge that it takes a collective effort, all of us really, to advance and advocate ethics at the lowest level. The impact might not be considered as relevant, but really people are watching, believe me. If we don't do that, we've seen in the legislative environment through case law and all that, self-regulation is becoming regulated because we don't want to conduct ourselves ethically in our conduct, behavior, or practices beyond what legislation dictates. So you find that legislation comes into play where professional bodies can take you to court for breaching the code of conduct or the ethical values. So it is incumbent on the individual to harness those that we bring into organizations and make sure that we do good for self and other and do no harm. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Talking about that intrinsic motivation. Katua, last word to you.
Thank you. Being an academic and being responsible for the ethics learning, I don't want to see it as teaching or facilitating, but students must really learn and develop their ethics competence. I truly believe, if we cannot, because a lot of people are saying, can we really train people or make people more ethical? I agree with Bonzek, who said, it's not necessarily about making people more ethical, but it's teaching people how to make better ethical decisions.
Thank you, Katua. That gives us something to reflect on for sure. And colleagues, panelists, you can see there's hearts, there's hands, there's wonderful comments in the chat expressing appreciation for your insightful contributions. From the Ethics Institute side also, I say thank you so much for a rich discussion, and we really appreciate you. And then for our attendees, we have more free webinars coming up next year. And of course, these will be all on topical issues, and you will be informed about it. And then just for those who are interested in the King 5, the fifth King report on corporate governance, in its what is its implications for ethics management within an organization, on the 11th of next month, November. We will have a discussion by Professor Dion Rousseau, who was on the advisory committee of King 5, as well as Ansi Rumalu, who is the chairperson of that committee. So we invite you to attend that. And then what we take away here today, my closing remarks to everyone would be the challenge, and we took that from our panelists. The challenge is ours to take on. Whether we rise to it, it depends on our willingness to act with integrity, keep the conversation going, listen to others, and of course, do the right thing even when it is difficult, organizational level, individual level, government level. If we commit to that, ethics can really become a real force for good, even in these very challenging times that we find ourselves in. And with those words, thank you, panelists, thank you, everyone online, and thank you to my team, Celia and Piwa and Fatima, who has been working in the background here, and everyone else. Have a good day.